Hi, welcome back. As you know, we've been doing some videos on the TRT that I'm running. So with that in mind, I thought it'd be a good idea to cover some diet basics, because obviously we're getting to middle age, or certainly I am beyond middle age. I'm 48. And these videos are kind of aimed at helping people that are in middle age get back into some good shape, feel good about themselves again. And I figured diet is probably like 70% of that equation. You know, it's a huge part of getting back into shape, and a lot of people just don't know the basics. So I wanted to do a series of videos covering some of that stuff for you. So I'm going to talk today about macronutrients and nutrient timing, and all these things kind of sound like they're ultra scientific and really complicated, but I'm going to break it down into very easy steps for you so everyone will know what I'm talking about. Now, macros or macronutrients, I'm sure you've heard gym bros and whatever talking about, hey, have you got your macros? All they're talking about is macronutrients, and that is the three major food groups, which is carbohydrates, fats and proteins. And you can pretty much break most foods down into those groups, so you can discern exactly what type of macronutrients make up your meal. This is important to know, because a diet that has really skewed macronutrients, you know, if you were just eating a bunch of fats and carbohydrates all the time and hardly any protein, you wouldn't be making any decent gains in the gym. And even if you didn't go to the gym, you would just be looking like crap. And I'll go into that in a second of exactly why that is and the type of ratios we're looking for. First, let's break down, you know, what kind of foods fall into those groups. Now, carbohydrates is a big one. A lot of people misunderstand carbohydrates. They get labeled as like evil, and people say, oh, I'm not having any carbs, you know, I don't have any carbs until X time of day, or I only eat carbs in the morning, or I don't eat carbs at all. Carbs are terrible for you. And people generally associate the term carbohydrates with sugars, and they tend to associate that with anything that tastes sweet, you know, like cakes, biscuits, chocolates, all that kind of thing. Carbohydrates are a much more diverse food group than just sweet things. You know, that tends to be the simple carbohydrates, your sugary based things, and even they're not particularly evil, and that's where we get into nutrient timing. But carbohydrates can be anything from potatoes, pasta, rice, even a lot of vegetables contain carbohydrates. Even some green vegetables contain a small amount of carbohydrates. Generally speaking, anything kind of starchy is going to have carbohydrates in it. A lot of grains contain carbohydrates. A lot of pulses contain carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are good because they provide glycogen to the body. Glycogen is like a quick form of energy that's utilized by the body. Very, very useful. If you're doing any sort of physical exercise, then your body is going to use the glycogen that it's got running around in it. Now, you have some glycogen in your bloodstream. You also have some glycogen held in your liver. And of course, you can consume glycogen while you're doing these activities, and that's going to give you even more of a top up. The problem comes with people that don't do any physical activity whatsoever, and they're just intaking carbohydrates all day long. Then you've got this excess of glycogen running around the bloodstream. So that's where people talk about blood sugars. If you've got high blood sugars all the time, then that's the kind of thing that's going to push you towards being diabetic. So obviously, health-wise, that's not a good thing. But on their own, you know, it's not an evil thing. If you had a really hardcore job, like you were a miner, or you're like a professional sports person, then you can basically consume carbohydrates. You can have that glycogen going into your body, and you're pretty instantly going to be using it up. This is one of the reasons that if you do some really intense exercise and you haven't got enough glycogen in your body, you haven't eaten that morning, for example, when you do some really intense cardio, you can feel completely out of it. You can kind of get a bit confused and feel really tired, and that's because your blood sugars have really dropped. Now, the speed at which carbohydrates give glycogen to your body differs. That's where you talk about foods that are high GI and low GI. You might have heard that term. So that's the glycemic index, you know, how quickly those foods can deliver sugar or carbohydrates to your body. And when people talk about glycemic index, they always think about sugars, but this is any carbohydrates. It doesn't have to taste sweet. So anytime you eat a food with some carbohydrates in, it's giving glycogen to your body. And you might eat some bread, for example, or some pasta. You know, it can be savory things as well. It could be porridge oats. All of those things are heavily leaning towards carbohydrate, and they're going to deliver this glycogen to your body. Why is there a difference in different food groups delivering it at different speeds? Because it depends how quickly those types of foods can be broken down. So let's imagine I drink some sugar water or some like a fizzy pop with some fructose syrup in it, which is probably one of the highest rated sort of glycemic index things that you could consume. The body doesn't have to do any work at all to get glycogen out of that. It's literally sugar water, you know, it's going straight in. Very, very simple job for the body to pull energy out of that without doing any work whatsoever. Now imagine you made some oats, you know, in the morning you got some really good quality jumbo oats. You cook them up so they're a little bit soft. But as you would know, if you've eaten oats, you know, they're quite a chewy thing to eat. And when you swallow them, you do obviously chew them up a bit in your mouth, but there's still a lot of work to do in digesting those. So it takes the body a long time to break them down into the stomach. And while it's breaking them down, you know, it's slowly pulling glycogen out of there as they're kind of going through your digestive tract. So the levels of glycogen going into your body, the blood sugar levels, are going to take a lot longer to start building up because it's just a slower process. This is where we talk about whole grain foods being beneficial. You know, there's lots of reasons whole grain foods are beneficial. They tend to have more micronutrients, which is all the vitamins and minerals and stuff. But generally speaking, the body has to work really hard to actually get the nutrients out of these things in the first place. And that's good because the body working, number one, that takes calories to do that. But number two, it slows things down to a much healthier level. You know, our bodies aren't designed to just consume like a ton of sugary water. For thousands of years, we would have had to work really, really hard to get some foods together. And then we would have consumed those foods. The body would have worked, you know, on these foods and kind of slowly consumed them. We didn't have fizzy drinks hanging around and Mars bars and chocolate cakes and stuff. It was basically that you would have to forage all day or hunt, and then those foods would be eaten, broken down slowly, and it would be a long process. So for thousands of years, that's what our bodies have done. It's probably only in the last 60 years or so that that's massively changed. And funnily enough, in the last 60 years or so, what have we seen? We've seen a global epidemic in obesity, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, all the things that kind of go with the terrible diet that we've now got. If you go to the places on earth where they're still living a kind of hunter-gatherer type culture, you tend to find that all those things are virtually non-existent. You know, there was a huge study done on heart disease, and it was basically centered, you know, the central points where heart disease is the most prevalent are also the places that are heavily populated and tend to be a highly developed economy there. So they've got, you know, restaurants and sweet shops and fast food outlets and all those kind of things. You go to the middle of the Amazon rainforest, people aren't obese and they're certainly not complaining about dying of heart attacks early. So we can understand carbohydrates are an important part of diet. You can have a diet that cuts carbohydrates out. I'll talk about that kind of diet in a later video. But for now, let's just understand that carbs aren't necessarily evil. It's just the case of how much carbohydrate you consume, what your kind of physical activity levels are, and what you're consuming them with. Then we have protein. So most people associate protein as being meat, but in fact protein is just a bunch of amino acids. When all those amino acids are put together, the body can use all those amino acids as kind of building blocks for tissue, right? So that's what we commonly associate protein as a muscle building element of our diet. And that's true if we consume all the right amino acids, so we have the whole group of them together, our body can use those amino acids to build muscle tissue. So it's really, really good for training. This is where some confusion comes in. So people talk about protein sources. Now, all that's important is that you get all those amino acids. What happens when you consume a food that doesn't have all those amino acids? So let's say I was a vegan and I consumed just a salad, you know, a bunch of different lettuce leaves. They do have some of the amino acids, but they will be missing one or two out of there. And that's a problem. When you consume those amino acids and there's a couple missing, the body makes up for that by actually scavenging the remaining amino acids from other parts of itself. So it will cannibalize its own tissue in order to utilize the amino acids it's just taken in. So you're never really winning that game, you know, because what you're eating in terms of amino acids, protein, you're basically kind of taking some out of your body as well to add to that in order to build muscle tissue. So you're tearing down to build back up. That's not a good system. Does that mean that you have to eat meat? No, it just means that you need to consume all the relevant amino acids. So then you would get into mixing foods up. And this is where, if we look into cultures, you know, like Mexicans commonly eat like rice and beans, a lot of these commonly eaten food groups, when they're placed together like that, and that's been done for like hundreds and hundreds of years, there's very good reasons for that. And the reason probably is that it creates a full spectrum of protein. So it's simply a case of picking out foods that would provide a full spectrum of those amino acids. So you can do that if you're vegetarian or vegan by having a huge mixture of different vegetables, different pulses, different legumes, you know, all in a great big mixed salad type affair. That would still give you a full protein spectrum. The trouble with it is obviously it's more labor intensive. So if you're very busy, you know, I've done this, I've had a vegetarian diet, I've had a vegan diet. I was vegan for about 4 years and it was doable. The problem was it was more labor intensive. When I lived in an area where there was tons of vegan cafes, it wasn't such a problem. But when I moved away from there, it meant I had to make everything at home. And of course, making things with many, many different ingredients, making it from fresh every single day, that was definitely more work than just going and buying some chicken, for example. Now, meat products and animal products in general, so meat, fish, eggs, they tend to have the full spectrum of all these amino acids, which means that you don't have to mix up a bunch of different food groups to get your protein from those. So the protein in those isn't particularly better, it's just a lot easier. You don't have to think about it. You know, if you eat some meat, you're getting your full protein value, and that's why people generally associate animal products with building muscle. It's just because it's the most convenient way of building muscle. Protein also happens to have a lower calorie count per gram than either fats or carbohydrates. So it's kind of the most diet friendly of the macronutrients, if you like. So now we have fats, the last one, which is definitely again something that's been demonized. You know, people say, hey, I'm on a no fat diet, I avoid all fats, fats are really bad. Fats aren't necessarily bad. In fact, fats are vital for survival. You know, they're vital for the healthy function of the human body. And there's many different fats that will have different effects on the body. And most of those effects are good, adverse to what you hear in the media and stuff about how terrible fats are. Most fats do something good for the body, whether they're doing something with your hormone levels. You know, we have to have cholesterol, for example, that helps us produce testosterone. Fats have probably been demonized because, like carbohydrates, they're high in calories. So over consuming them is not a good idea, right? Although our body needs fats to be healthy, too much fat is unnecessary, and that ends up getting stored. You know, there's only so much the body will take, then it tends to store the fat away for later use. That's probably a throwback from thousands of years ago, like we spoke about earlier, where we had to work really, really hard to get our calories in. You know, you'd be grafting all day, finding foods out in the wild, hunting animals. You know, you would spend a lot of calories chasing down an animal or foraging for foods out in the wild. If you're going to spend a lot of calories doing that, your body has to have a way of kind of storing whatever you've got, because sometimes you'll have an abundance of food. If you suddenly found like a bunch of honey or something like that, or if you suddenly had to slaughter an animal and it had like a ton of fat and meat on it, you know, you would try and eat all that as much as you could, because they didn't have fridges and freezers back then. And at one point they didn't even understand about salting foods to keep them. So they would just sort of gluttonously eat as much as they possibly could, because they couldn't guarantee where they were getting their next meal from. If the body didn't have the ability to store any of that energy, what would you do? You would end up dying, right? The fact our bodies are able to store fat was a necessity for keeping us alive back when we needed to kind of just eat whatever we could find and we weren't sure when the next meal was coming. But now we live in a modern world where pretty much everyone in a developed country is able to get as much food as they want. They can store it for as long as they want. We don't really need fat storage in those situations anymore. So that's where people are just over consuming and they're getting fatter and fatter. So how should we balance those nutrients, and what is nutrient timing? So nutrient timing is interesting. It's something I've always paid close attention to with my diet, because I believe, based on what we know about what those food groups do for your body in the good ways and the bad ways, there's times and places to consume those food groups. So in the morning, our bodies tend to be starved of blood sugars because we've been asleep all night, we haven't been eating anything. We tend to crave carbohydrates when we wake up. You know, there's a reason that a sweeter breakfast kind of seems appealing. It's because your body's craving carbohydrates. And we also need to start getting going for the day. You know, that's a time where you need to get some energy to actually go and start doing stuff if you're going out to work. So it's quite common for people then to have some carbohydrates. And I always have some carbohydrates in the morning. I normally have some porridge oats and some fresh fruit or some dried fruit, something like that. And that gets me set up for the day. After that, I don't consume any more carbohydrates until after I've worked out, and that will be in the evening. So the rest of the day, I'm literally only consuming meals that have fats and protein in them. Now, I'm very careful in the morning not to consume anything too fatty. So I have my porridge. I might have a little bit of yogurt in it as well, a low-fat yogurt, because I want some protein value in that porridge as well. Now, oats on their own aren't a full spectrum of amino acids, so they're not going to be like a full value protein. So you're only getting some carbohydrates really out of that. That would kind of be a bad idea to consume just on its own if your aim was to build muscle tissue, because, as I said before, your body's going to start scavenging its own amino acids to make up for the missing ones in those oats that you're eating. So with the oats, I would have a little bit of yogurt as well. So I'm getting some protein in there as well. I'm topping up the amino acids in the oats. So I'm getting a full spectrum out of what I'm eating. But I would avoid anything high in fat at that point. Why do I avoid anything high in fat? Because I've just spiked my insulin levels. Now, the glycemic index of oats, although it's lower than like liquid sugars, as we spoke about earlier, it's still going to raise your blood sugar levels. What happens when you raise your blood sugar levels? That raises your insulin levels. Your body starts releasing insulin in order to shuttle away those blood sugars, move them around the body. And insulin's like, imagine it like a train. It's also shuttling a bunch of other nutrients around it, creates a hormonal cascade, and that creates a situation where nutrients are getting stored. You know, all these hormones get cascaded when you eat certain food groups, and that's in order to store all the nutrients that come out of those foods. So fat will get moved around the body and stored. If you consume a bunch of fats when you've got that hormonal cascade going on, you're increasing your chances of those fats being stored. So people that eat diets that are very high in carbohydrate fat meals, so something like a pizza is a good example of that, right? You've got the carbohydrate, which is your bread base, then you've got a ton of cheese smeared all over it, that's your high fat. You might have a little bit of protein in there, but predominantly it's a carbohydrate and fat meal. Another example of that would be like donuts. You know, they're deep fried carbohydrates. Of course, they're high in carbohydrates, high in fat. People that eat like that all the time tend to have a lot of midsection body fat. You know, they have a big sort of ring around their body of fat, they tend to have quite skinny arms and quite skinny legs. And that is one of the reasons that those people, if you go to a doctor and you get examined and they will look at your midsection and say, well, you're very big around there but not so much on the rest of your body, that is predisposing you to be diabetic, because it's an indicative factor that your diet is massively high in carbohydrates and fats. Those things are intrinsically linked. So it's a really good idea not to consume those things in massive quantities together. I don't want to spike my insulin levels and then consume massive amounts of fat at the same time. So I'm going to have my porridge in the morning. I'm going to send my insulin levels higher. That's fine. I'm going to have my protein. Insulin levels going higher is actually helpful. If you're consuming protein, then that's helping the protein to get sent around and stored, which we want. You know, we want to intake protein and store that because that's going to help us build muscle tissue. For the rest of the day before I work out, all I'm going to do is consume meals which have protein and fats in. So I'm going to be careful after my breakfast. I'm not going to be consuming things that are going to spike my insulin levels. So I might have things like a couple of chicken breasts and then some salad with a dressing or something like that, an olive oil dressing. So I'm having some healthy fats, I'm having my vegetables, and I'm having some protein. I'm not having bread with that, I'm not having a sweet afterwards, I'm not having any biscuits with it, I'm not having any crackers or rice cakes. You know, this is one of the big problems with the diet industry, is they only talk about calories, Weight Watchers and all those different sort of diet fad things that people do. They only consider calories, and the amount of times I've seen people stuffing their faces with rice cakes, smeared with hummus, and I'm like, you're literally consuming like pure sugar there, because rice cakes are just broken down in the body so quickly. They're going to spike your insulin levels through the roof. Hummus is full of fats, good fats mainly, but you know, full of fats, or avocado the same, very, very fatty, and you're just massively predisposing yourself to store all that fat around your midsection. So people don't think about this stuff, you know, they just think in terms of calories. Everyone neglects this sort of thing in diets because it's maybe more complicated than people are happy with, and that's why people don't get results. That's why you look around the gym and 80% of the gym looks like crap, because no one can be bothered to work out this stuff about their diet. So then I get to working out. You know, I've had my protein fat meals all through the day when I'm working and whatever. Then I get to work out. Now I've kind of burned any excess glycogen that was in my body because I've had a really hard workout, and my body is now in a state of what's called catabolism. So it's actually starting to cannibalize its own muscle tissue in order to give itself more energy, you know, because I've exhausted my glycogen stores. Again, this is something the body does in order so that we don't just keel over and die. You know, back in the days before we had all this convenience and food storage and everything, if we were to run up the side of a mountain and get really, really worn out as we were getting to the top, it would be useless if we sort of run out of glycogen on the way up there, so our energy levels suddenly dipped and then we just passed out and laid on the floor and couldn't move. So the body gets around that by cannibalizing its own muscle tissue, and it will basically convert that cannibalized tissue into glycogen so it can utilize that as energy. So it's a very, very effective way of staying alive and staying able to be active. Now we live in a world where we've got, you know, food available all the time, and we probably don't need to run up a mountain. That thing that the body can do may be kind of surplus to requirements. Anyway, we don't want to be in this catabolic state after we've worked out. We don't want to be breaking down muscle tissue. Again, that's completely adverse to what we're going in the gym to do. So the way around that is to consume some carbohydrates, because if we have glycogen in our body, entering our body and in our bloodstream, the body will stop breaking tissue down in order to supply itself with that glycogen. So that would be a time where I might be consuming some what people would consider more unhealthy carbohydrates. I tend to eat those rice cakes then. Actually, after the gym I have like 2 or 3 rice cakes because they're very quick acting, they spike your blood sugars quite high, they tend to be very low in fat. Another way to do it is to consume a shake with some carbohydrates in, and there's lots and lots of studies on this. You know, if you look at what to consume after the gym, people talk about protein shakes. Actually, there's very little scientific evidence to suggest that consuming protein shakes after a workout is going to do anything beneficial for your muscle. If you look into that, you will find that consuming a good amount of protein in the day, all day and all night, a good protein value at the end of the day is important. You know, that's vital. You have to consume enough protein. It doesn't particularly matter if a large portion of that protein is consumed before, after the gym, or any time around the gym. It doesn't matter. What does matter, and evidence supports this, is the consumption of carbohydrates immediately after working out. That has been linked to growth in muscle tissue over and above groups that didn't consume those carbohydrates after workout. You'd be much better off drinking like a carbohydrate based shake after workout. Some people consume a shake with waxy maize starch in it. I've consumed shakes with brown rice flour in it. There's all kinds of carbohydrate based things that you can put in a shake. Some people grind up oats into a really fine powder and consume like an oat flour in the shake after workout. The only reason I would add protein powder to that as well is because basically consuming those carb shakes on their own, if you just put rice flour in water and consume that, it tastes absolutely disgusting and it's so unpalatable you wouldn't be able to drink it. So putting some chocolate or strawberry protein whey with that as well, that will allow you to drink that, and it will be far more palatable. That's pretty much the breakdown of how I work out a meal plan in terms of macronutrients and how I time those nutrients and why I time those nutrients like that. And people always want to mess with that. You know, if anyone has asked me for a diet in the past and I tell them the diet and I tell them how to kind of time those nutrients, people always want to change things up, and they're like, yeah, but I really like to eat carbs at 9 o'clock at night, or I want to, you know, do this at this time or whatever. Okay, that's fine, but then your results are going to be, you know, questionable. The whole point of nutrient timing is it's important when you consume those nutrients, and it's not something you can just mess about with and say, oh, but I like to have carbs with every meal. Okay, have your carbs with every meal, but know that that's going to maybe give you some additional fat storage. Of course, it matters how much food you eat. So no matter how we time our nutrients and the type of foods we're eating, it matters if you're over consuming. So we'll go into that in the next couple of videos. We'll talk about calories and how many you should have a day, all that kind of stuff. But for now, I just want you to understand how I kind of look at a diet in terms of its basic structure. If you have any questions on macronutrients or the basic kind of layout of the diet, chuck them down below. I'll do my best to answer those. Next time I'll talk about calories, how many you should be aiming for, what they are, what does it mean when people talk about, you know, calorific burn per day, metabolic rate, all that kind of stuff. We'll go into all that. Thanks for watching. Take care. I'll catch you all next time.